Sometimes the dead don't stay buried, especially when they were never properly buried to begin with. Sam had always been supportive of his girlfriend, Maya's academic pursuits, but when she began spending 12-hour days at the abandoned convent of St. Marguerite, he started to worry. The 16th century building sat like a rotting tooth on the outskirts of town, its Gothic spires piercing a perpetually gray sky. Maya, pursuing her master's degree in art history, had received special permission to document the frescoes that decorated its crumbling walls. Maya had always been passionate about her work, but this project seemed to consume her in ways that made him uneasy. She'd return home with plaster dust under her fingernails and chalk smudges on her clothes, speaking rapidly about iconography and religious symbolism until late into the night. "It's incredible, Sam," she'd say each evening, her eyes bright with excitement as she sorted through photographs and sketches. "The artwork tells the story of the convent's entire history. But there's something strange about the chapel's east wall." At first, Sam was intrigued by her enthusiasm. "Listen," she whispered, pressing her palm against the faded fresco. "Do you hear that?" The air in the chapel felt thick and oppressive, carrying the musty scent of centuries-old decay. "Hear what?" When Sam asked about her extended hours, she'd wave him off, muttering about optimal lighting conditions and preservation concerns. Maya's voice was barely audible. "She's been tapping all night." She knocked on the plaster with her knuckles, producing a distinctly different sound than the surrounding areas. "Someone's in there." Her appetite dwindled, and dark circles appeared beneath her eyes like bruises. Her fingers traced the painted face in the fresco, a face that, Sam noticed, bore an unsettling resemblance to Maya herself. She'd begun bringing blankets to the convent, claiming the chapel grew cold near that particular wall. She'd started leaving offerings, wildflowers, candles, even small portions of her lunch. Chunks of paint and mortar lay scattered around her like fallen snow. It was a common punishment for heretical nuns, immurement, that sealed them inside a small chamber with just enough food and water for a few days, and then leave them to die. "She's asking me to let her out," Maya whispered. It was faint, barely perceptible, but unmistakably there, a rhythmic tapping from somewhere behind the wall. "She's been asking for so long, and no one listens. You hear her now, don't you?" "But I can hear her. She's so cold, Sam. She's asking me to let her out." The wall section Maya fixated on depicted St. Marguerite, the convent's patron saint, surrounded by other nuns in prayer. But the rhythm was too deliberate, too purposeful. The fresco, while faded, seemed unremarkable compared to the more elaborate works adorning other walls. "She's been cold for almost 500 years. The change began subtly. Maya started arriving home later, sometimes not until well after midnight. She brought research materials to the convent, spreading them across makeshift tables constructed from broken pews. She'd discovered references to Sister Beatrice, a nun who'd apparently vanished from the convent records in 1542, coinciding with a period of religious upheaval and accusations of heresy. "What do you mean?" "She's been catatonic for 6 months now. It's confined to a psychiatric facility where the doctors speak in hushed tones about dissociative episodes and academic stress." The construction crew reported strange delays, equipment failures in the chapel area, workers refusing to go near the east wall. When they finally brought it down, they found a small chamber hidden behind the frescoes. It's large enough for a person to stand. "They don't understand why she's always so cold, why her room temperature has to be kept at nearly 80 degrees just to prevent her from going into hypothermic shock." One evening, 3 weeks into the project, Maya didn't come home at all. When he arrived at the convent later that morning, he found her sitting perfectly still before the wall, her hands pressed against the painted face of St. Marguerite. Her notebook lay open beside her, filled with increasingly frantic sketches of the same image. A woman's face, mouth open in what could have been prayer or a scream. Sam found her the next morning, sitting cross-legged on the chapel floor, staring intently at a section of the east wall As Sam drew closer, he realized she was humming, a low, mournful melody that seemed to resonate from the stones themselves. The temperature around the wall had dropped even further, and frost was forming on the windows despite the mild October weather. "Maya," Sam's voice echoed in the cavernous space. "You've been here all night." She didn't turn around. Sam approached cautiously, stepping over chunks of fallen masonry. The tapping. Sam listened, but heard only the settling of old stone and the distant drip of water through a compromised roof. "I think you need some sleep," Sam said gently, reaching for her hand. Maya jerked away. "You don't understand. Swall, it's hollow. There's a space behind it." Over the following days, Maya's obsession intensified. They walled her up, Maya explained to Sam during one of his increasingly frequent check-ins. The research was compelling, but what disturbed Sam most was how Maya spoke about Sister Beatrice, not as a historical figure, but as a present reality. "She's so cold, Sam," Maya would say, her breath visible in the inexplicably frigid air surrounding the east wall. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Sam arrived at the convent to find Maya on her knees before the wall, her fingernails bloody from clawing at the plaster. "Maya, stop." Sam grabbed her wrists, pulling her hands away from the wall. She looked at him with wild eyes, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. Sam pulled Maya to her feet, intending to get her out of the building, when a sound stopped him cold. Tap, tap, tap. Maya smiled through her tears. The tapping continued, growing slightly more insistent. Sam stared at the wall, his rational mind searching for explanations. Settling wood, trapped animals, old pipes. "We need to leave," Sam said, his voice tight with growing panic. "I can't leave her," Maya replied, returning to the wall. "Not when she's finally talking." Sam managed to convince Maya to come home that night, but she was back before dawn. "Maya," she didn't respond. "She's not cold anymore," Maya said, without turning around. "She's not asking to get out." Sam felt ice forming in his veins. Maya finally looked at him, and Sam saw that her lips had taken on a bluish tint. Her breath came out in thick, white puffs. "She's asking me to come in." That was the last coherent thing Maya said. Sam never went back to the convent, but he heard it was finally demolished last month. It was empty, but the walls were covered in scratch marks. Maya still doesn't speak, but sometimes, late at night, the nurses report that she taps on the walls of her room. 3 soft taps, followed by silence, then 3 more. As if she's answering someone. Some silences are meant to hide screams. Clara learned this the hard way when she discovered what the monks at St. Bartholomew's had been keeping quiet about for over a century. Clara had always sought solitude in times of crisis. But after her divorce finalized and her mother's funeral arrangements were settled, she craved something deeper than a weekend retreat. The advertisement for St. Bartholomew's Monastery appeared in her inbox like Providence itself. Experience true silence and spiritual renewal in our 800-year-old sanctuary. Brother Thomas, the only monk permitted to speak with visitors, greeted Clara at the heavy oak doors. His weathered face bore the kind of serenity that comes from decades of practiced silence. Week-long stays available for those seeking profound introspection. The brothers haven't spoken in 47 years, saved for emergency situations. We ask that you respect this vow during your stay. The monastery perched on a cliff overlooking the North Atlantic, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to disappear into the mist. But as she listened, the scratching took on a desperate quality, like fingernails clawing at stone. Stone along the wall, starting near the floor and climbing higher, as if something was trying to claw its way up from below. The walls were thick stone, older than most countries, and they seemed to absorb sound itself. Even her footsteps felt muffled, but it came from inside solid stone walls that had stood for centuries. The wall looked normal, aged granite blocks fitted together with centuries-old mortar. But the breathing continued, accompanied by what sounded like muffled sobs, ragged, labored breathing coming from within the wall itself, followed by a voice so close it seemed to whisper directly into her ear. This couldn't be real. Exhaustion, stress, grief, they were playing tricks on her mind. "You'll find the quiet takes some adjustment," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. Whatever was in there was trying to get out. Clara's room was Spartan but peaceful. A narrow bed, a wooden cross, a small desk, and a window that framed the restless ocean. She lay still, wondering what had disturbed her sleep when she heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching coming from inside the wall beside her bed. The first 2 days passed in blessed tranquility. Clara walked the monastery grounds, meditated in the chapel, and felt the knots in her shoulders finally beginning to loosen. Time moves differently in the dark. "Help me find my grave. Tell them to dig me up. I've been trying to tell them for so long. They buried the wrong one in the cemetery. I'm still here." Sounded like an army of fingernails clawing at stone, and the breathing multiplied into a chorus of gasps and whispers. All the wrong ones. All the ones who woke up too late. "I fell ill in 1923. They thought I died, but I woke up in the dark, in a box in the ground. I screamed until my throat bled, but no one came. The others, ... they still think I'm at peace." The monastery felt different in darkness. Larger, older, full of shadows that seemed to reach for her as she passed. Needed to find Brother Thomas. Needed to find someone who could explain this madness. "I'm still alive." In the moonlight, streaming through a high window, his serene expression looked different, knowing, perhaps even guilty. The monks moved through their routines like ghosts, acknowledging her with gentle nods, but maintaining their sacred silence. There, carved into the wall, was a brass plaque she hadn't noticed before. Meals were communal but wordless, filled only with the soft clink of spoons against bowls. But on the third night, something changed. Clara woke to darkness so complete it felt solid. The luminous hands of her travel clock showed 3:17 a.m. Clara realized with growing horror that the sound was uncoming from just her room. It was coming from everywhere, from every wall, as if the entire building had become a tomb. At first, she rationalized it away. Old buildings settled. Mice nested in the walls. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by something far worse. Breathing. They buried the wrong one. She remembered Brother Thomas's voice calling after her. "You can't leave now. You've hurt them. You're part of their secret." Every single one who was buried too quickly, mourned too briefly, forgotten too easily. She claimed she'd stayed at St. Bartholomew's Monastery, but when authorities investigated, they found only ruins. Stones scattered by a landslide that had occurred, according to geological surveys, sometime in the 1940s. They've been trying to tell us the truth for decades. And sometimes, when she's falling asleep, she swears she can hear her own voice whispering from inside the walls. Clara's blood turned to ice water. The voice was clear, unmistakably human, speaking perfect English with what sounded like an American accent. But some voices refuse to be silenced. Some truths refuse to stay buried. She grabbed her phone and activated its flashlight, casting harsh shadows across the ancient stones. At the bottom, scratched in with what appeared to be fingernails, was a new line. "It's about keeping secrets. Please," the voice whispered. Clara pressed herself against the opposite wall, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. But then the scratching resumed, more frantic now, and dust began to fall from between the stone blocks where the sound originated. "Who are you?" Clara whispered, feeling foolish, even as the words left her lips. The scratching stopped immediately, as if her voice had been heard. "Margaret," came the reply. "Sister Margaret." Clara's rational mind fought against what she was hearing. "That's impossible. You'd be over a century old." "Death doesn't age you," Margaret whispered. And Clara could hear the smile in her voice, a sound more terrifying than any scream. The scratching intensified, now coming from multiple points along the wall. "We're all here." Other voices joined in, overlapping and echoing strangely. Clara ran. She burst from her room and sprinted down the moonlit corridor, her bare feet slapping against cold stone. But as she rounded a corner, she stopped dead. In memory of those who rest in sacred silence, Sister Margaret Flynn. 1923, Brother Augustine. 1934, Sister Catherine. 1941, may their voices find peace below the plaque. Fresh scratches scored the stone wall, spelling out words in desperate clawed letters. "We are not at rest." Clara stared at the message until her eyes burned, then looked up to find Brother Thomas standing at the end of the hallway. "God, you heard them," he said simply, breaking his decades of silence. Clara nodded, unable to speak. "We've been keeping them quiet for so long," Brother Thomas continued, walking toward her with slow, measured steps. As he approached, Clara noticed something that made her blood freeze. His fingernails were worn down to the quick, and stone dust clung to his robes. "The vow of silence," he explained, now standing close enough that she could smell earth on his breath, "isn't about finding peace." The scratching from the walls grew louder, spreading through the entire monastery like a plague of desperate voices. "How many?" she whispered. Brother Thomas smiled, and in that smile, Clara saw centuries of terrible knowledge. "All of them," he said. The last thing Clara remembered clearly was running toward the monastery's exit, the scratching following her through every corridor like a wave of awakening dead. Clara was found 3 days later by local police, wandering the coastal highway in a state of delirium. The strange part, in Clara's coat pocket, they found a brass plaque, tarnished with age, inscribed with names and dates from the 1920s through 1940s. "Clara Mitchell, 2024. She finally heard us." Clara claims she has no memory of taking the plaque, but she still hears the scratching in her apartment walls late at night. They buried the wrong one. Some sounds are meant to stay buried with the dead, and when they rise again in the darkness, they bring something terrible with them. Jacob's father had been the groundskeeper at St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church for 32 years, and in all that time, the massive pipe organ had never made a sound. The instrument dominated the sanctuary like a cathedral within a cathedral, towering brass pipes stretching toward the vaulted ceiling, rows of wooden keys yellowed with age, stops labeled in faded Latin that no one could read anymore. According to church records, it had been broken since 1973, the year Evelyn Marsh collapsed and died while playing the closing hymn at Easter service. Jacob had grown up in a small cottage behind the church, helping his father maintain the grounds since he was old enough to hold a rake. He knew every creaking floorboard in the sanctuary, every crack in the stained glass windows, every shadow that the moonlight cast through the Gothic arches. The church held no mysteries for him, except for the organ that loomed silent and forgotten in the chancel. At first, he thought he was dreaming. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, complex weaving of harmonies that seemed to fill not just the church, but the very air around their cottage. But as consciousness crept in, Jacob realized the sound was real, drifting through the thin walls and rattling the windows with its deep, resonant bass notes. His father's voice was tight with an emotion Jacob had never heard before. The organ had been broken for decades. Who could be playing it? And why did his father look like he'd seen a ghost? "Stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run." Even in the dim light, Jacob could see the fear in his weathered face. That changed on a bitter February night when Jacob was 19. The only person who knew that song, he whispered, died on the organ bench 50 years ago. The music grew louder with each step, more intricate and beautiful. But there was something underneath the melody that made Jacob's skin crawl, a discordant undertone that seemed to vibrate in his bones. Jacob's father fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he tried each one. His father's knuckles were white around the shotgun's grip. No sheet music exists. She took it to her grave. The music paused for a moment, and in the silence, Jacob could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Her posture was perfect, her movements fluid, as if she'd been playing for hours instead of decades. Jacob's father pushed open the heavy wooden door, and they stepped into the narthex. The temperature dropped immediately, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The stained glass windows began to rattle in their frames. The church's heating system had been turned off hours ago, yet somehow the sanctuary ahead glowed with warmth and light. Warm light glowed behind the stained glass windows of the sanctuary, casting colored patterns on the headstones. The figure at the bench swayed with the rhythm, her fingers dancing across the keys with inhuman speed. Evelyn Marsh died Easter Sunday, 1973. I was here. I helped carry her body out. The music was overwhelming now, every pipe of the massive organ singing in perfect harmony. As he drew closer, Jacob could see his father's face go white with terror. Jacob could see the keys moving on their own, depressing and releasing in a complex dance, while the wooden stops shifted position without any visible hand guiding them. The music continued, a piece he'd never heard before, yet somehow felt familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. Temperature plummeted, and Jacob's breath came out in sharp puffs of vapor. He'd been asleep in his bedroom when the music started. Jacob stumbled to his window and peered across the moonlit cemetery toward the church. Terrible melody that was never meant to be finished, played by hands that should have been still for half a century. His father appeared in the doorway, fully dressed and gripping his old Remington shotgun. "Dad, what? ... Get dressed. Now." His father grabbed him and they ran, bursting through the church doors and across the cemetery, not stopping until they were safely back in their cottage. They spent the rest of the night huddled in the kitchen, doors locked, curtains drawn, neither speaking of what they'd witnessed. As Jacob pulled on his clothes, his mind raced. They crossed the cemetery in silence, their footsteps crunching on the frost-covered grass. The church's main door was locked, as it always was. "Dad, who's in there?" His father finally found the right key and turned it slowly. The lock clicked, unnaturally loud in the stillness. Jacob's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" Evelyn Marsh. She was composing that piece when she had her heart attack. Never finished it, never played it for anyone. The music resumed, more urgent now, the tempo building toward some unknown crescendo. They moved forward slowly, past the empty pews, toward the chancel. But it was the bench that made Jacob's legs nearly give out. Someone was sitting there, figure in a pale dress, long gray hair flowing down her back, fingers moving across the keys with impossible grace. Jacob's father raised the shotgun, his voice cracking as he called out, "Stop, stop playing." The figure didn't respond. If anything, the music grew more intense, the bass notes so deep Jacob could feel them in his chest cavity. "She can't hear us," Jacob whispered, though he wasn't sure how he knew. His father stepped closer, the shotgun still trained on the organist. The music reached its crescendo, every pipe singing at once in a harmony so beautiful and terrible it brought tears to Jacob's eyes. Then, as suddenly as it began, the music stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The warm light faded from the sanctuary, plunging them into darkness, broken only by pale moonlight filtering through the windows. The figure on the bench remained perfectly still. Jacob's father approached slowly, the shotgun lowered, but ready. "Dad," when his father spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "She's still warm." The figure at the bench began to turn around. Jacob never saw her face. The next morning, Jacob's father submitted his resignation. They moved away from St. Bartholomew's within the week, leaving no forwarding address. Yet, even now, 20 years later, Jacob sometimes wakes in the middle of the night to the sound of organ music drifting through his dreams, a beautiful. And in those moments, he knows that somewhere in an empty church, Evelyn Marsh is still playing her last hymn, waiting for someone brave enough to let her finish the song she died creating. And with that final story, we pull back from the abyss. For now, tales of ordinary lives brushing against the extraordinary, the terrifying, the unexplainable, from the shadow that mimics to the voice that calls from an empty house. We've seen tonight how thin the veil between our reality and a much darker one can be. These stories are not just fiction. They are born from real experiences, whispered in hushed tones, and shared to remind us that we are not always alone. And that's the most chilling thought, isn't it? Perhaps one of tonight's stories reminded you of something that happened to you or to someone you know. A strange occurrence you've tried to forget. A noise in the night you rationalized away. A figure you saw for just a second. The details of your own brush with the darkness are what give this channel life. I invite you to leave your own story in the comments below. Let us know what you've seen in the shadows. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, show your support by hitting that like button. It helps these tales reach others who need a reminder to check their locks at night. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell. We have so many more stories to share, and you won't want to be left in the dark. Until next time, remember that you are not afraid of being alone. You are afraid of the bone-deep certainty that you are not.